balanced budgets. That's up 4 points since the last time Ipsos asked that question in September of 2020.
Based on what the government's been saying about what it wants to do with the budget, there's a pretty good alignment between what Canadians are hoping for and what it is that the government's been trial ballooning about what they want to do. What is really surprising in the numbers, though, is some of those really specific items, and you're even seeing them come out during the Liberal convention about, boosting the childcare programs, things that are related to a green recovery. Those kinds of things do not seem to have the overwhelming level of public support that things like, for example, more universal, shorter-term types of supports for people who are struggling through this pandemic. That those are the things that tend to have more support associated with them. And supporting that type of public spending doesn't mean that governments have a blank check to be able to pursue whatever type of program that they want. Canadians have a fairly limited view of what this is. And not only that, there's a speed governor on here, which is a desire to see that the government's serious about at some point trying to get public spending under control. And they do see that as being part of what they should be required in the budget.
66% of Canadians also say they're in favor of the government running whatever size of deficit is necessary to get through the pandemic, up 9 points over the same period.
Even though there has been some commentary about the likelihood that there's going to be increased public spending and increasing deficits and ultimately an increase in debt. And Canadians do want to see a government at some point deal with that. In the immediate term, the real focus is on getting Canadians who need support, the type of support they need to get through this pandemic. So they're fighting right now a situation in which they believe that they need government support, and whatever needs to be done needs to be done. The issue for the federal government is how it deals with the idea that there is going to be ongoing deficits and and a building Canadian debt. And the challenge for them is to put the right tone, I would say, around this. Do they have an intention to deal with it? Is it something that's on their minds? At the moment, you don't really seem to be hearing that out of the federal government right now. It's not, they're doing this with reluctance. They seem to be doing it with a certain amount of I don't want to say jubilation, that's the wrong way to put it, but a certain amount of belief that this is a great opportunity to invest in a whole bunch of things. Well, Canadians are a little more cautious about that, I would say, than the government is right now. So even though the political support is there pretty much for whatever the government wants to do, and particularly in the short term when it comes to supporting Canadians as they get through this pandemic, but seeing that the public spending going up and celebrating spending is not really where Canadians are right now. And you see that clearly in the numbers. The longer this goes on, the longer people think it will go on. So when we initially started into this, a year ago, or slightly over a year ago, and we'd ask people back last March, for example, how long do you think this is going to last? They'd say it would be over by June. That definitely didn't happen. But the problem with that is that it sets the horizon for what people are thinking about very short term. So it's and unidimensional. It's really focused on the pandemic itself and dealing with it in immediate terms. So if you've got a government coming forward and saying, look, we've got this great idea about building back better, and we're going to have a great green recovery, and we're going to get Canada back on the right track, and all of these many myriad of different things, the potential for that to come off as not getting how desperate people are feeling right now about the short-term circumstances, that's a potential vulnerability for the government. Along with, on the other side of this, communicating the right tone about all of the spending that's going on right now being absolutely necessary, to a certain extent, somewhat with reluctance that it's being done, rather than seeing it as a great investment in all sorts of things that people want to do for the future. When you move into that space, it becomes a lot more controversial and the nation's much more divided on it.
As for priorities in the upcoming budget, 43% of Canadians want taxes reduced for low and middle income earners, while 38% want taxes hiked for the wealthy. Rounding out the top three priorities, 23% want increased spending on programs to reduce poverty.
This is one of the easiest points to score in any kind of political debate. So I was somewhat surprised that more Canadians weren't supportive of doing that. Canadians are and I would say people just about anywhere, are generally supportive of taxes that they don't have to pay. So if people don't feel they're among that wealthy segment that's going to be paying the taxes, it would be pretty hard to understand why they would get less than 100% for that. But what we're seeing is a certain amount of reluctance around that. Granted, there is support for increasing taxes among the wealthy, but that support's not unanimous, and it leads one to ask the question why that might be. And it might be that they feel that the government's becoming a bit too tax happy, or that they feel that there's a potential downside for expanding potentially what the definition of what a wealthy person is, and they may get drawn into whatever that category of taxation might be. So it's not like it should have been, at least in terms of my experience, it should have been a really easy win for the government, but it doesn't seem to be overwhelmingly easy. Yes, it's easier than a lot of other things that the government could be doing, but there's still some reluctance.
Times has Canada faced a challenge like this, and today's budget is expected to provide more money to help communities through the immediate crisis. We are also expecting an ambitious plan to kickstart the post-pandemic economy, so expect a big focus on childcare and plans for a green recovery. As part of the slogan the Liberals use called Build Back Better, it's a slogan the American President Joe Biden likes to use too. Expect more spending, big spending, to help people and businesses cope. And it's hoped, as I said, to kickstart a recovery. Canada's budget watchdog estimates that in the last fiscal year, Canada spent more than $271 billion on COVID measures. More than $89 billion went to the emergency wage subsidy to help businesses and employee wages, and more than $67 billion went to the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, or CERB. People and individuals relied on that money, and that has sent the federal deficit soaring to an estimated $363.4 billion in 2020 and 2021. That's more than 9 times what it was in the previous fiscal year when the deficit was at about $39.4 billion. We used to think that was high. This is spending on a level that has not happened since the end of the Second World War. Pre-pandemic federal budgets came with some strict rules for reporters who used to be put in lockups for hours. They'd all have to gather at the same place and be given advance access to the budget documents so they could study them. And they were unable, of course, for those hours to make anything public until after 4 p.m. Eastern. That's when the finance minister delivers the budget to Parliament. Because of the pandemic, though, everything's changed with the lockup. It's virtual this year, and reporters are working from their homes or some of them in offices. And while the Finance Minister, Chrystia Freeland, will actually be present in the House of Commons today, we will see her stand there and deliver the budget. There won't be very many MPs in the House. They, like the rest of us, have learned how to do things virtually, so there'll be a few people there, but don't expect a whole coterie of MPs. We have a team of reporters in the virtual lockup today, and they will be ready to break down and analyze today's numbers and promises when the finance minister formally tables the budget in the House of Commons. Before going into this virtual lockup this morning, our chief political correspondent, David Aiken, laid out what he will be watching for.
Well, I'm really looking at this budget as sort of the pandemic and beyond budget, and it's going to be very thick, 700 pages. And in my, nearly 20 years covering budgets, that's going to be about one of the biggest, thickest budgets I've ever seen. Lots will be in it for pandemic and beyond. But as I mentioned, first order of the day for the federal government, just like any government in the country, let's get through this pandemic, through the public health challenge and the economic challenge. Beyond that, I expect we're going to see some talk about some big new programs for the beyond part. National child care program, or some sort of way to improve child care availability and affordability right across the country, possibly using the Quebec model. Look for talk about the National Pharmacare program. That's something New Democrats have been pushing for. The Liberals are ready to start moving forward on that. We'll check out that. And then the Liberals say this pandemic is a time of opportunity, that's their phrase, to build back better. So lots of green initiatives, billions of dollars for a so-called green recovery. For consumers, look for some new taxes. Our friends at Reuters reporting new luxury taxes are on the way. If you buy an expensive car, an expensive boat, expect to pay more. Could also be some taxes on some digital platforms that we often use, a Netflix tax, something that's been talked about for a while. Could see a Netflix tax today and other taxes consumers will pay for some digital services. Businesses should also see possibly some new programs in the budget. The Toronto Star reporting that the Liberals today will announce a Canada Recovery Hiring Program, and that will be to be a subsidy for businesses as they bring on new employees, adding to employees. We're going to see that Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy continue. A lot of businesses using that, but now a new one, the Recovery Hiring Program, give Canadian business owners an incentive to bring more people back on the job. So there'll be lots in this budget. Of course, we'll have complete coverage for the budget 2021 pandemic and beyond. Back to you.
Forward to hearing more from you a little bit later, David. Chrystia Freeland is the first female federal finance minister in Canada, and it seems to me like that should have happened long before 2021, but never mind, at least it's happening now. And it is expected Freeland will look at some things through a different lens than her male predecessors did. Freeland took over this job from Bill Morneau back in August of 2020, and on the day that she took the job, she spoke about how her feminist agenda would inform her work in shaping Canada's economic recovery.
I'm glad that I'll have an opportunity to bring my experience as a woman as a mother to this really important challenge our country is facing.
Joining me now is economist and Atkinson Fellow on the Future of Workers, Armin Yalnizyan. Armin, you've been closely tracking the impacts of this pandemic on women now. And for months, you have been saying there is no recovery without a she-covery, and there's no she-covery without childcare. In a nutshell, for people who still don't get it, why is childcare so important?
Because women can't go to work when they've got a job. They can't accept work when they've got a job if there's no safe place for them to leave their kids. And since most provinces across the country have been unable to offer, the most populated provinces have been unable to offer secure schools, a lot of women have been doing the lion's share of homeschooling at home. And a lot of childcare centers, which are operated as businesses, not as social infrastructure, have had to reduce capacity. So there's been less opportunities for people to keep the spots that they've got or get a spot if they need one. So it's just like a road or a bridge. If you were to cut off 30% of the roads and bridges in your provinces, you think you can reopen and everything's fine? No, you're going to have to do something about that part of the infrastructure. Childcare is critical social infrastructure. And if we let it decline, women can't get back into the workforce.
What do you hope to hear from the government on this?
Well, we've been hearing since last fall that we have the first ever female finance minister that gets the role of women in the economy and understands how childcare is a critical piece of social infrastructure, not just a market service that you can buy, that we need to actually publicly fund and publicly manage what is essentially the education of our youngest learners. And I am hopeful that it will not be just a case of throwing more money at it, because it sounds like no matter what happens, they're going to throw more money at it. But women know it ain't how big it is. It's how you use it. And so we're hoping that it isn't just a large amount of money, but a large amount of money that actually builds on a system instead of expands a market that is failing far too many kids. There's childcare deserts all over the country, notwithstanding the fact that people are spending a fortune on childcare. And a lot of people turn to any kind of childcare just to warehouse their kids so they can go to work. Well, that's like leaving money on the table. We could be spending that same amount of money to ensure that every child is learning ready when they enter school and learning supported as they go through school. And when you maximize the learning potential of the next generation of kids, you're going to maximize their earning potential through life.
Armin, is Quebec getting it right? They have, the most heavily subsidized, most affordable childcare of any province in the country. Are they doing it the right way? Is that a model that should be replicated?
Well, we often talk about the Quebec model because the part of it they got right is they made care affordable and accessible everywhere. But what they knew immediately, having expanded access to care by simply putting money in people's pockets and not paying attention to the quality, as you pointed out, is that the kids who needed the most help didn't have that type of care available in their neighborhoods. So they were being taken care of by somebody down the street or around the corner, or in a church basement, but they weren't getting the quality of care that they needed. So Premier Legault in Quebec actually would be the first to tell you that quality is still something that Quebec, who is the undisputed leader in access to quantity, quality is the thing that Quebec needs to work on. And in fact, when he campaigned to become premier, one of the things he campaigned on is the thing that Ontario leads in, thanks to the previous premier, Kathleen Wynne, who introduced full-day junior kindergarten and senior kindergarten, which means that for 6 hours a day, your kid has got access to high-quality care that's publicly managed, regulated, is quality controlled. It's free to you for 6 hours a day. And so that's the model that we need to be working on, is educating down, actually treating early learning and childcare as an education system, as a way that we're helping our youngest become their best potential selves.
All right, we'll see what happens in this budget. Fingers crossed. Armin, thank you so much. Well, every budget we talk about shoes. It's a bit of a shtick for whoever is finance minister. They get a pair of new shoes or they recycle old ones. It's a symbol of the sort of budget it's going to be. Well, Chrystia Freeland unveiled her new budget shoes on Twitter.
I chose to buy my shoes from a great Canadian woman entrepreneur whose showroom for her company, Unveils, is based in my own riding here in Toronto.
So there you go, a locally made company. They're black high heels, and Freeland says they show her support for small local businesses hit hard by the pandemic. She says she knows businesses are still struggling, and the government, she says, will be there to provide support. I'd say good luck to her wearing those heels, because I've all but given up on wearing them. But anyway, leading up to today, we've heard from industry stakeholders and experts, and now it's time for everyday Canadians to weigh in. One of our producers in Ottawa, Crystal Ogue, put the call out to see what people are looking for in today's budget. Here's some of what people said.
Well, I'd like to see just some continued support for small business. I think we all need to be weaned off some of these subsidies and things over time, obviously, because it's just not sustainable unless we can sustain ourselves. But certainly in these extenuating circumstances, it's nice to be able to rely on those a little bit longer. Also, I'd love to see some help for the businesses that are just falling through the cracks.
I'm a student, so it's like, okay, what are we going to do for summer jobs? Last year we had the student support. This year I haven't heard anything. And the way things are in Toronto, the uncertainty around whether or not there is going to be any summer jobs available. So it's support for students. I haven't heard any talk around, is there going to be a special like last year to get us through the summer? Because for a lot of students, we rely on the summer jobs to earn enough money to pay our school fees and our living expenses for the rest of the year. And if you don't have that, then you're stuck.
I would like to see in the federal budget a guaranteed livable income or a basic income for all Canadians. Wanting to see like a living wage. I know that this is more of an Ontario issue than a federal issue. But it is upsetting to see that like even the most frontline workers who have been saving us through this pandemic, the retail workers and the grocery store workers, are still not even making enough to be able to live off of. That's very, very, very troubling for me. And then I'm also seeing like just the cost of housing become literally impossible in this country. And that's really, really troubling. And I want to know if the federal government will do something about that. Because at this point in time, you know, I'm approaching my middle age and I can't afford a house.
One of my biggest wishes, I guess you could say, for the federal budget would be to see more focus and more finances being put towards improving Indigenous communities. Why is there so much poverty in communities? Like, why is it a thing? Why don't they have great internet? You know, how are we supposed to be living in a digital world when a lot of us can't? We don't have the resources. So yeah, I would love to see that. Like, why are they having to boil water for their entire existence?
I would like to see in the federal budget some pushback on this quality, affordable daycare for all families. I think that that's a very strongly advocated issue right now that's happening, and I think that really needs to be addressed. There's a lot of stress in the world right now, and having extra stress, wondering, you know, what my bills are going to be like at the end of the day, what my account's going to look like. Can I afford a little extra food this month? Do I need to drive a little less? It's a big issue. It's a mortgage payment. Like in a sense, it's another mortgage payment. People are paying way too much money.
A lot of people concerned about money, obviously. Small businesses are huge employers in this country. They adapted and moved on and cut costs and racked up huge amounts of debt in order to try to survive. Many have not. I don't think we're going to Laura Jones right now. I don't believe we have a connection for her. I think we're moving on to Daryl Bricker, if I'm not mistaken. So we know that the Liberal government has mused about the idea of possibly triggering or having a federal election, although, of course, Justin Trudeau says he has said repeatedly he does not want a federal election, that there's too much going on at the moment. But he does have a minority government and would like nothing more than to have a majority again. So budget bills are confidence votes. It's conceivable that there could be a confidence vote that brings down this government. Let's go to Daryl Bricker, who's patiently waiting there with Ipsos polling. Daryl, you've done a lot of polling on whether people want a federal election at this point. I mean, it's hard for me to see. Let's just be frank, I don't want one right now because we got enough news going on. But that's just my personal take. But what about Canadians? Where are they at in terms of desire or lack of for a federal election?
Well, it's interesting, Donna, about 55% of Canadians would disagree with you. They want to have an election. But the interesting part of that is that they're almost all opposition voters. So people who want to have at the government as opposed to people who want to support the government. So given those kind of conditions, you would really wonder why it would be that the Prime Minister would trigger an election. And I'll just throw two other things at you. Over half of Canadians think that an election at this time would be unfair. And secondly, over half of Canadians think it would be unsafe.
To organize in a, we know that some provincial elections have gone well. We know the one in Newfoundland did not go so well. So it is a lot to consider, certainly. Daryl, you also asked Canadians what issues matter most to them right now. We just, prior to coming to you, heard some people bringing up some really specific issues about how they are hurting financially right now. What did you find out in your polling?
Well, there's really a couple of different things that we find out. First of all, overwhelmingly people care about the pandemic, but most of what they care about is fairly short term. So it's dealing with the crisis as we have it right now. A lot of what people were talking about in the package that you were discussing were things that were longer term problems and specific issues that are things that have been around outside of the pandemic. So their focus tends to be on things specifically related to the pandemic as opposed to all of this other stuff. And the other part that didn't really get discussed, which is still pretty important for Canadians, is whether or not our deficit is too high and whether our debt is becoming too high. And there still are an awful lot of Canadians that are concerned about that. So even though people want to have a lot of things paid for, somebody has to pay for it. And if it's coming out of our coming out of all of us by increasing our deficit and our debt beyond dealing with this pandemic, that's when it starts to get problematic.
Mm-hmm. Nobody wants to see this amount of spending, and yet I can't imagine there's much of an appetite for any increase in taxes either, which is the only real way to start adding some revenue.
Well, in fact, what we found in our survey was that people, the thing that was at the highest level of support was cutting taxes for lower income and medium income Canadians. There is support for increasing taxes for the richest, but people still want to see tax cuts for themselves. So it's interesting. They have a whole list of things that they want to spend on. They really don't want to pay anything for it. They're concerned about the deficit and they're concerned about the debt. All of that does not come together easily.
All right, Daryl Bricker, thank you so much for your insight. Will be interesting to see what we find out in the next, I guess, 40 minutes or so. Thanks so much. For more on what to watch for in this budget and what it means for Canadians, I want to bring in Sahir Khan in Ottawa. He is Executive Vice President of the University of Ottawa's Institute for Fiscal Studies and Democracy. Sahir, start with big picture. What are you expecting in tone and context from today?
Big measures already kind of telegraphed. It makes it a little unusual this year. You're almost kind of walking into a budget, kind of getting a preview of things that are kind of being tested politically. So I think it's less of a mystery of the measures. I think fiscally, we're kind of looking at three things. Do we end up in a position that leaves us kind of fiscally sustainable? Number two is like, what's the mix on dealing with the pandemic recovery and response? And then number three, what do we kind of have for the future? And how are we set up for an economy that's as big as it can be, as productive as it can be, so that we don't return to kind of the stagnation type growth, anemic growth that we had pre-pandemic. So I think there's a lot kind of riding on this budget to try to address kind of those three things, and a lot of different expectations, both from economists, but also, I think, politically as well, as Daryl Bricker kind of just explained.
Mm-hmm. The deficit of, as the Liberals state, under $400 billion is just a remarkable amount of money, highest it has been since the end of World War II. And yet, I think across the board, there's consensus that people and businesses needed to be helped through this pandemic. The money had to be spent. So it is that fair to say?
It is, and I think the IMF has backed up kind of your point that this recession would have been far worse had the federal government not intervened. and keeping in mind that the provinces really didn't have the fiscal capacity to respond. So it would make sense that 80% of the support has really been coming from the federal government. So I think, yeah, without that kind of support, we would have seen a much worse kind of economic situation. And commensurately, we would have seen a much worse fiscal situation had the federal government not intervened the way it had.
What is your biggest concern about that amount of spending, though? I mean, I guess it's, we hear telegraphed that there will be efforts, initiatives to try to kickstart the economy. What's your greatest concern about that?
I think we worry a lot about the headline numbers and size of deficits. I think for fiscal people like me, we try to pay as much attention to the composition of that spending and the quality. Are we getting results for this? Because if we're going to hand over a big mountain of debt to the next generation, are they going to inherit a productive economy, an innovative economy, a big workforce that's well-trained, young people that can find good-paying jobs and pay taxes? If that's the legacy of this budget, then that will be something that I think that government Canadians can really buy into, and Canadians in particular. So, but if it's just transfers, and if we just see spending increasing without it kind of being investments, and I use the word investment specifically to mean a return to the economy of those expenditures. If we see expenditures and very little to show for it, then we're telling the next generation that they're going to compete globally with one hand tied behind their back. And I think that's really the challenge for this government and this upcoming budget.
Just one final quick question, Zahir. The NDP called for a wealth tax. We know there are lots of people. There's effectively two pandemics. There are a lot of people like me who have been working through it all, have had the luxury at times of working from home. A whole bunch of other people in that same situation, and a whole range of other people, of course, who are not in that situation, who have to go to work, whether there are restrictions in place or not, who live in congregate settings, who take, public transportation, who just are putting themselves at much greater risk in order to earn a living. Is the idea of doing something to tax the wealthy, or at least have them pay a bit more at this point, an idea that has legs, do you think?
Well, I think that there's kind of a technical answer to that and a political answer. I think the technical answer is that when you try to put income taxes on the highest earners in Canada, they have a way they tend to have the tools to get around some of those. They have a way to shift money around and move them, even out of the country if necessary. The other issue is a political one. Do you really want to do a lot on the tax front ahead of a potential election that we're expecting this fall? And my suspicion is probably not the right time for politically for taxes. What it does suggest, though, is that maybe we have to look at our tax base and ask ourselves whether we have the right mix, whether the right instruments, and the right levels of taxation. We've had a rather steady decline in revenue relative to the size of the economy, growth of the economy for a long time now. The Harper government reduced the GST by 2 points. That's worth about $16 billion a year in revenue. And so it's really a question of how much does this current government want to reoccupy that space that the federal government used to have. And that's, I think, a more fundamental question that might be worth discussing in the context of the next election.
All right, Zahir Khan in Ottawa, thank you so much for your insight today. I appreciate it.
My pleasure, Don.
We want to take you to Parliament Hill now. The Finance Minister, Chrystia Freeland, is expected to meet very shortly with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau before presenting her budget in the House of Commons. They usually walk over there together. It used to be down the steps and into the House of Commons. Of course, that's all changed because of renovations and because of the pandemic going on. So at the moment we see Chrystia Freeland and the Prime Minister there, we'll probably they usually carry the budget document, which David Aiken, I think, said is 700 pages. So it's going to be a bit of weight for them to carry, but they usually hold it up for a photo op and we can get a sense of what their sort of slogan is and what their tone is for the day. Now, small businesses, of course, are huge employers in this country. And as I said, they have adapted. They've moved online in many cases. They have cut costs. And they've racked up huge amounts of debt in order to try to survive. Many have not survived. I want to bring in Laura Jones. She's Executive Vice President of the Canadian Federation for Independent Business. Laura, I've read that 70% of small businesses took on new debt in the pandemic, amounting to about $135 billion.
There's something more?
What are they looking for in this budget?
Well, there are a couple of big things that small businesses are looking for. The first one, by far and away, is do no harm in terms of additional taxes or costs. The cupboards are bare. As you said, businesses have taken on, the majority have taken on debt, and that average is around $170,000 per business. So, and there's a huge wide range around that, depending on what sector you're in, or whether you're a downtown business versus someone that might be in a smaller community. But that's a lot of debt. So no new taxes, no new costs. That by far and away, 9 out of 10 businesses across Canada are saying, please, we can't, the cupboards are bare. There's no room for that right now. That's a big thing. The second big thing is making sure there's enough support to see businesses through the pandemic. And, increasingly, unfortunately, this looks like we're going to need that, well past June. And we're getting indications that is going to be in the budget. So that will be some good news for businesses. But as long as there are restrictions in place, there should be supports to go along with those restrictions, is the view of the majority of Canadian small businesses.
I think the government has telegraphed that they are going to continue the supports for a couple of months at least. The impacts of the pandemic, as we've been saying, are so uneven across the country, given how infection rates and restrictions vary so much from province to province. How do you think that complicates the federal response?
Well, it's interesting when you look at businesses in the West that have been more open, and I would say that British Columbia and some of the other Western provinces have done a better job of kind of really targeting the risks in order to keep as much open as possible while managing the health part of the pandemic. So you can still go to a hairdresser in Vancouver. Of course, that's not the case in Toronto or in Peel right now. And so what you're seeing in our numbers is while the vast majority of businesses still need support, that's a little bit less in Western Canada, and you're seeing a little bit more deficit hawkishness in the West. So again, all businesses understand we're in extraordinary circumstances. We need to run big deficits right now. But in the West, you see more of a sort of let's make sure there's a plan to get out of this medium term, a bit of a stronger appetite for that than in some of in Ontario, for example. And I think that just reflects the tale of two pandemics. Businesses across the country are struggling, but if the stress in the West and British Columbia is high, it's off the charts right now in provinces like Ontario that have been more restricted. In fact, we have the fewest businesses in Canada open in Ontario, and the fewest businesses reporting that they're back to normal revenues, only 1 in 4 in Ontario. So things are pretty dire compared to 1 in 3, for example, in British Columbia, which is still bad, but it's a little bit better.
Yeah, it is absolutely dire in Ontario in particular, and extremely difficult for individuals and businesses and essential workers and everybody, just wishing the vaccines would arrive soon, sooner than they have. Thank you so much, Laura Jones, Executive Vice President of the Canadian Federation for Independent Business. We appreciate your time. We have a team of journalists and experts standing by. They've been studying the budget document all morning and will be ready to reveal what's in it as soon as the finance minister appears and that embargo is lifted. We are going to continue our coverage here on Global News Online, and in just a moment, we'll also welcome viewers watching on the Global TV network.
Les habla Óscar Avendaño de Exploring Solutions Canada. Quiero compartir con ustedes que hemos incluido un nuevo servicio para ti: financiamiento de vehículos nuevos y usados. Sí, escuchaste bien. Enfocados en ti, nuevos inmigrantes, estudiantes internacionales o cualquier residente ya establecido con o sin crédito. Toda situación migratoria será atendido. Por favor, Llámanos al 905-920-2143 y comienza a conducir tu carro ahora.
During this uncertain time, we're doing our part. Our financial centers may be closed for in-person meetings, but our dedicated financial advisors are adapting to the new reality of virtual and electronic business, focusing on what they do best, listening and providing professional advice to you, their clients. Our more than 700 financial advisors across Canada have been working tirelessly to respond to your questions and concerns. Being proactive and committed, they aim to bring a sense of confidence and security in your financial future, despite the circumstances. Our financial advisors are here for you, now more than ever. From all of us at Desjardins Financial Security Independent Network, stay safe and healthy.
Recovery is part of the Trudeau government's strategy to deliver on their slogan that they like to use, Build Back Better. Well, as Finance Minister and Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland plays a big role in this government, and this is a big moment for her. We just saw her walk into the House of Commons there. As soon as we see her stand up and begin to deliver the budget, that's when we can reveal what is in fact in it. Our reporters have been in a virtual lockup through the course of the day, so they've been reading through those 700 pages and will be able to distill at least the big picture elements of what is in the budget. As we wait for that, it should be happening momentarily. Let's go to our Ottawa Bureau Chief, Mercedes Stevenson. Mercedes, I know you can't talk about what's actually in the budget yet. People will just have to hang on for a few more minutes. But the Liberals have really telegraphed quite clearly what they hope this budget will do and even some figures of how much money they expect to spend. What are the dominant themes at play?
Well, I can talk about the themes before the budget, and I'll be very careful here, Donna, because as you know, we can't say anything that is in the budget, and I can't even show you the budget, which I have actually next to me down there at the side of the desk, because we are waiting for it to be released under embargo. But obviously, the biggest thing the government has been thinking about going into this is COVID-19. And this has been the third wave that has devastated much of the country, certainly for those of us here in Ontario, a very, very serious situation. And the government has really had to think about that in terms of how are they going to deal with this budget and what they were going to put into the budget. And they've made no secret of that fact. They've made no secret of the fact that this would likely be a big spending budget. They've made no secret of the fact that they were looking at this as an opportunity to try to roll out childcare. And we'll find out if that's happening in the budget. But certainly the Deputy Prime Minister / Finance Minister, Chrystia Freeland, has been very clear about dropping big hints that that is expected to be a big theme in this. And of course, getting Canadians back to work is something else that the government has talked about a lot, as well as supporting individual Canadians, because as we're in this third wave, and you know, a lot of folks are finding themselves out of work or worried that they will be out of work.
Alan says it's very
Mercedes, votes on budgets are always confidence votes, and this, of course, is a Liberal minority government. So in theory, the opposition could trigger an election over this if they wanted to. But we already know that is unlikely, right?
It is. And, you know, Donna, at any other time in a minority government, especially when you're talking about some of the things this government was talking about going in, if they show up in this budget, which were controversial, those could be things that a government either stays or falls on. And a lot of horse trading would have been required with the opposition. They did not have to do the same kind of horse trading heading into this budget as they normally would in a minority, because the NDP has already said that they likely wouldn't bring the government down, that they don't want an election. The Conservatives don't want an election. Although they might more safely be able to vote against this budget than, for example, the NDP, because they're not at risk of bringing the government down with just the Conservatives alone. We'll see how they react to what is actually in the document when they have a chance to look at it. But when you look at the country right now, and when you look at what happened in the recent election in Newfoundland and Labrador, there's just really a feeling among MPs from all ridings that there's no appetite for an election. So while this will still serve as very much being a political political election document that the Liberals will go into what could be a summer or fall election with. The chance of the government coming down on this is relatively low, but remember, it is always still there. This is a minority and anything could happen.
Hard to imagine an election, especially in Ontario right now, right, with everything that is going on there. Mercedes, as we wait for the finance minister, hopefully she'll rise and begin speaking shortly and we can reveal the details of the budget. But she's, oh, I believe she is. There she is. Let's listen for a moment.
The details regarding these measures are included in these documents and pursuant to Standing Order 83-2. I ask that the study of these motions be added to the orders of the day.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, there are the budget documents handed over. 700 pages in French and English, of course. We're going to go directly to our reporters who know what is in those documents because they've spent the last several hours digging into all the details in a lockup. David Aiken now joins me from the West Block. David, I believe you're there. Can you give me the big takeaways? What are the headlines in this budget?
Here on Parliament Hill, the big headline is this, spending. So Chrystia Freeland is proposing to spend $50 billion in spending programs this year, and that is on top of the billions of dollars of emergency pandemic spending that will continue to exist. That means significant deficits for the next several years with no target date for a balanced budget. The federal deficit for the fiscal year that just ended on March 31st is expected to be about $354 billion, and that will, as expected, push the national debt past the $1 trillion mark for the first time. Ottawa expects the deficit this year to top $154 billion, but projects a drop in 2022-2023 to under $60 billion and to be around $30 billion by the spring of 2026. The centerpiece of the first budget ever presented by a woman is a commitment to build a new national childcare program.
This budget makes a historic investment in early learning and childcare. After 50 years of talking about it and fighting for it, we're finally going to get it done.
But it will not be cheap or quick. It will cost $30 billion over the next 5 years and will require significant negotiations with the provinces. That's the biggest single spending commitment, but there are plenty more. For example, $3 billion to improve long-term care homes, $17.6 billion for so-called green recovery initiatives, and a new investment of $18 billion to improve health and economic development in Indigenous communities. On top of that, the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy and the Canada Emergency Rent Subsidy will be extended until the end of September. Something new for business, a Canada Recovery Hiring Program that will start in June. This will be a subsidy paid to employers who add people to their payroll. The budget also establishes a minimum wage for federally regulated companies of $15 an hour. All of this will push the debt-to-GDP ratio from pre-pandemic levels of about 30% to more than 50% this year, and it will stay around 50% for at least the next 5 years.
The question is, are we fiscally sustainable? We are, but there's a big but. That also makes assumptions that things like interest rates will not change significantly in the medium term.
And so, Donna, now we turn to the politics of this budget. And this budget document, it's 724 pages. There is a ton of stuff in here for all the political parties to pick over. And as you mentioned, it's a minority government that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau leads, which means he's going to need at least one other party to sign on to his plan and avoid triggering a general election this spring. Donna?
I know you've had the advantage of reading through at least some of the 700 pages, way more reading than I've been able to do. So can you break down for our audience a little bit of the childcare plan, which, as you said, is the centerpiece of this $30 billion, I believe you said. Is there detail about how it will be spent and how they will try to implement their long-promised, talked-about plan for some kind of universal childcare?
Well, the first thing to know is next month, there's not going to be a new childcare space in your neighborhood. I think that's clear. It is a national program, a national sustainable system. That means finding and building more childcare spaces, training more childcare personnel. And here's the big thing that's going to take time is talking to the provinces about how to do this. Chrystia Freeland, the finance minister, wants to model this on what they're doing in Quebec, where they have $10 a day childcare. And she is vowing in this budget that somewhere over the next 5 years, maybe 3 years, there will be $10 a day childcare for everyone right across the country. That is her goal as she starts in on this with this big bucket of cash, $30 billion. But that cash is going to have to go to provinces who will administer these programs. And Donna, you've seen this movie a million times.
Oh my goodness,
when a federal
yes.
says to the provinces, you want to do this? They'll say, well, just give us a cash and we'll figure it out. So, that's the details is, what do you want to do with all this money, provinces?
Yeah, I mean, and the reason is because daycare is a provincial responsibility and childcare is a provincial responsibility. So it sort of has to be this way in the way we're organized in Canada. Am I right about that?
You are. And here's the other thing. When Chrystia Freeland shows up to say, hey, will you guys run my childcare program? Here's what the provinces are going to say. This is about the stuff not in the budget. Always important to know what's not in a budget. What's not in this budget? Any increase in the amount of money that Ottawa transfers to the provinces for health care. And again, you've heard this before, the premiers have been crying for the last year for a huge increase in what's called the Canada Health Transfer. That's the money transferred every year to the provinces for health care. There is no increase. The Trudeau government continues what the Harper government started, which is a minimum 3% a year increase. The provinces wanted something 6, 7, 8% more. They're not getting it. So that's not in the budget. Other things not in the budget. Really nothing moving on national pharmacare. There's just keep talking to the provinces again on that. There's no move here to try to impose a wealth tax. That's something the NDP wanted. There's no move here. There's not even mention of a universal basic income. And that, too, is something New Democrats wanted. There is some luxury taxes. If you were planning to buy an expensive car or a private aircraft, you're going to pay extra tax. But that's it in terms of targeting more taxes at the rich. Again, we need one party to sign on here. And if it's New Democrats, I can see it right now. We'll hear from Jagmeet Singh, I know, later. And he's going to be saying, where's the, I want to eliminate billionaires. That's what the NDP voted at their convention. They want more taxes on the wealthy, and they're not in this budget.
Well, I think there were more billionaires created, or more people became billionaires in 2020 than ever in history. So, you know, there are 2 pandemics going on here, and there are plenty of people who have gotten very rich and done very well through the course of this pandemic, and then a whole bunch of hundreds of thousands of people who are not in that position and who desperately need government help and better programs. In particular, getting back to the child care thing, you know, this is so kind of central to not only to this government, but to Chrystia Freeland as a person. Right? She has said that as a woman and a mother, her experience will inform the kind of finance minister that she is. Did you see her sort of fingerprints on this document?
Yes, very much. And she of course, I mean, she broadcast this in the fall economic statement, saying almost what you just did, Donna, in the House of Commons, saying, you know, as a mother, as a woman who is the first female finance minister in our history, this is important to her. She talked about it as well with Ken Dryden, the last architect of a child care program nationally that went nowhere. She talked with Dryden at the Liberal convention. So she is very much invested in this. And by the way, she pointed out, certainly, yes, she's a mom and all that. But one of the important things here is, you know, childcare is no longer, it hasn't been probably for 10 or 20 years, a, quote, woman's issue. It is a core economic issue, and that is how the finance minister is portraying this, to saying, listen, we're in a time when we have 2-parent families, and childcare is crucial if we're going to increase labor participation rates, which means then we increase general prosperity, increase our tax base. It is fundamental being able to say to parents, you can still go to work and still raise kids. That's why we need a child care program. And I don't think there's a lot of argument with the rationale there from probably all the provinces. Again, the issue will be provinces are really going to be annoyed that there's no Canada Health Transfer, and they're going to say, listen, you got a deal here. You want this child care? We do too, but you got to give more for health care. So definitely this is Freeland's This is the marquee proposal in this 724-page budget, but it is going to take a lot of lifting, and it's nothing that's going to happen anytime soon.
David, what about the green recovery? And we were telegraphed at least that was going to be a critical piece in this budget too. Not so much for right now, but to kickstart the economy. And when we rebuild, it will be a green rebuild.
Dream job you fought to get because there was no way to keep working while caring for your young children. Did you graduate last spring, and are you still struggling to find work? Is your family business, launched perhaps by your parents, and which you'd hope to pass on to your children, now struggling under a sudden burden of debt and fending off bankruptcy through sheer grit and determination every day? If COVID has taught us anything, it's that we're all in this together. Our country cannot
All right, that
prosper.
is the Finance Minister, Deputy Prime Minister, still delivering her speech here on her first budget, the first budget in a couple of years. Of course, there was slated to be one after the election, and that got interrupted and pushed back because of the pandemic. We've had a couple of fiscal snapshots since then, most recently this past fall, but this is really our best and clearest picture of how much the government has spent on the pandemic and what it sees as the way out of this and how it plans to create growth. And so to that end, let's bring in our senior business correspondent, Peter Armstrong, to talk a bit about that in terms of where does the growth come from and how much of it is just betting that all this money, $101 billion of stimulus, is going to do that for them, Peter.
It's going to do a lot of the heavy lifting, isn't it? Rosie, I've said this to you before, that on budget days and economic update days, I have the easiest job, that I get to ignore the flowery rhetoric and all the words, and I just go to the back and I pull out the annexes and I see what the numbers actually tell us. And the numbers in this are staggering. They are large, they are sweeping, and they are across the board. And it's not just COVID or childcare, it's everything. And yeah, they're going to wind down some of the bigger programs, but going forward, the number that jumps out at me is the one that Dave Cochran just mentioned, $354.2 billion as the deficit. And
to support Canadians not covered by employment insurance will remain in place through September 25th and extend an additional 12 weeks of benefits to Canadians. As our economy fully reopens over the summer, the benefit amount will go to $300 a week after July 17th. Low-wage workers in Canada work harder than anyone else in this country for less pay. In the past year, they have faced both significant infection risks as well as layoffs. And many people live below the poverty line, even though they work full-time. We cannot ignore their contribution and their hardship, and we will not. We propose to expand the Canada Workers' Benefit to invest $8.9 billion over 6 years in additional support for low-wage workers. This will extend income top-ups to about 1 million more Canadians and lift nearly 100,000 people out of poverty. And this budget will introduce a $15 an hour federal minimum wage. COVID has exposed the dangerous inadequacy of sickness benefits in Canada. We will do our part and fulfill our campaign commitment by extending EI sickness benefits from 15 to 26 weeks.
We know the pandemic has exacerbated systemic barriers faced by racialized Canadians. So, Budget 2021 provides additional funding for the Black Entrepreneurship Program, as well as an investment in a Black-led philanthropic endowment fund to help fight anti-Black racism and improve social and economic outcomes in Black communities. One of the most striking aspects of the pandemic has been the historic sacrifice young Canadians have made to protect their parents and grandparents. Our youth have paid a high price to keep the rest of us safe. We cannot and we will not allow young Canadians to become a lost generation. They need our support to launch their adult lives and careers in post-COVID Canada, and they will get it. We will invest $5.7 billion over 5 years in Canada's youth. We will make college and university more accessible and affordable. We will create job openings in skilled trades and high-tech industries, and we will double the Canada Student Grant for 2 more years, while extending the waiver of interest on federal student loans through March 2030. More than 350,000 low-income student borrowers will also have access to more generous repayment assistance. COVID has brutally exposed something women have long known. Without childcare, parents, usually mothers, can't work. The closing of our schools and daycares drove women's participation in the labor force down to its lowest level in more than 2 decades. Early learning and childcare has long been a feminist issue. COVID has shown us that it's an urgent economic issue too. I was 2 years old when the Royal Commission on the Status of Women urged Canada to establish a universal system of early learning and childcare. My mother was one of Canada's redoubtable second wave of feminists who fought, and outside Quebec failed to make that recommendation a reality. A generation after that, Paul Martin and Ken Dryden tried again. This half-century of struggle is a testament to the difficulty and complexity of the task. But this time, we're going to do it. This budget is the map and the trailhead. There is agreement across the political spectrum that early learning and childcare is the national economic policy we need now. This is social infrastructure that will drive jobs and growth. This is feminist economic policy. This is smart economic policy. That's why this budget commits up to $30 billion over 5 years, reaching $9.2 billion every year permanently to build a high-quality, affordable, and accessible early learning and childcare system across Canada. This is not an effort that will deliver instant gratification. We are building something that, of necessity, must be constructed collaboratively and for the long term. But I have confidence in us. I have confidence that we are a country that believes in investing in our future, in our children, and in our young parents. Here is our goal. 5 years from now, parents across the country should have access to high-quality early learning and childcare for an average of $10 a day. I make this promise to Canadians today, speaking as your finance minister and as a working mother. We will get it done.
Alors que nous prenons
In making this historic commitment, I want to thank the visionary leaders of Quebec, particularly Quebec's feminists, who have shown the rest of Canada the way forward. This plan will, of course, also provide additional resources to Quebec, which might well use them to further support an early learning and childcare system that is already the envy of the rest of Canada and indeed much of the world.
Small businesses are the vital heart of our economy, and they have been hardest hit by the lockdowns. Healing the wounds of COVID requires a rescue plan for them. So, Budget 2021 proposes to extend the wage subsidy, rent subsidy, and lockdown support for businesses and other employers until September 25, 2021, for an estimated total of $12.1 billion in additional support. To help the hardest hit businesses pivot back to growth, we propose a new Canada Recovery Hiring Program, which will run from June to November and will provide $595 million to make it easier for businesses to hire back laid-off workers or to bring on new ones. But our government will do much more than execute a rescue. With this budget, we will make unprecedented investments in Canada's small businesses, helping them invest in new technologies and innovation. We will invest up to $4 billion to help up to 160,000 small and medium-sized businesses buy and adopt the new technologies they need to grow. The Canada Digital Adoption Program will also provide businesses with the advice and help they need to get the most out of these new technologies by training 28,000 young Canadians, a Canadian Technology Corps, and sending them out to work with our small and medium-sized businesses. This groundbreaking program will help Canadian small businesses go digital and become more competitive and efficient. Le financement accru.
Increased funding for the Venture Capital Catalyst Initiative will help provide financing to innovative Canadian businesses so they can grow. We will also encourage businesses to invest in themselves. We will allow immediate expensing of up to $1.5 million of eligible investments by Canadian-controlled private corporations in each of the next 3 years. These larger deductions will support 325,000 businesses in making critical investments and will represent $2.2 billion in total savings to them over the next 5 years. Building for the future means investing in innovation and entrepreneurs. So, we propose to invest in the next phase of the Pan-Canadian Artificial Intelligence Strategy and to launch similar strategies in genomics and quantum science, areas where Canada is a global leader.
In 2020, job growth means green growth. This budget sets out a plan to help achieve GHG emissions reductions of 36% from 2005 levels by 2030 and puts us on a path to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. It puts in place the funding to achieve our 25% land and marine conservation targets by 2025. En effectuant des investissements.
By making targeted investments in transformational technologies, we can ensure that Canada benefits from the next wave of global investment and growth. The resource and manufacturing sectors that are Canada's traditional economic pillars, energy, mining, agriculture, forestry, steel, aluminum, autos, aerospace, will be the foundation of our new, resilient, and sustainable economy. Canada will become more productive and competitive by supplying the green exports the world wants and needs. That is why we propose a historic investment of a further $5 billion over 7 years, starting in 2021, 2022 in the Net Zero Accelerator. With this added support, on top of the $3 billion we committed in December, the Net Zero Accelerator will help even more companies invest to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions while continuing to grow their businesses.
We will propel the green transition through new tax measures, including for zero emissions technology, carbon capture and storage, and green hydrogen. We are at a pivotal moment in the green transformation. We can lead, or we can be left behind. Our government knows that the only choice for Canada is to be in the vanguard. Our growing population is one of our great economic strengths, and a growing country needs to build. We need to build housing. We need to build public transit. We need to build broadband. We need to build infrastructure. And we will. We will invest $2.5 billion and reallocate $1.3 billion in existing funding to help build, repair, and support 35,000 housing units. And we will support the conversion to housing of the empty office space that has appeared in our downtowns by reallocating $300 million from the Rental Construction Financing Initiative. Houses should not be passive investment vehicles for offshore money. They should be homes for Canadian families. So, on January 1st, 2022, our government will introduce Canada's first national tax on vacant property owned by non-resident, non-Canadians. Une croissance forte et
Strong, sustained growth also depends on modern transit. That's why, in February, we announced $14.9 billion over 8 years to build new public transit, electrify existing transit systems, and help to connect rural, remote, and Indigenous communities. Therefore, we are committing an additional $1 billion over 6 years for the Universal Broadband Fund to accelerate access to high-speed internet in rural and remote communities.
We intend to draw even more talented, highly skilled people to Canada, including international students. Investments in this budget will support an immigration system that is easier to navigate, more efficient in welcoming the dynamic new Canadians who add to Canada's strength. Our government has made progress in righting the historic wrongs in Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples. but we still have a lot of work ahead. It's important to note that Indigenous peoples have led the way in battling COVID. Their success is a credit to Indigenous leadership and self-governance. We will invest more than $18 billion to further narrow gaps between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, to support healthy, safe, and prosperous Indigenous communities, and to advance reconciliation with First Nations, Inuit, and the Métis Nation. We will invest more than $6 billion for infrastructure in Indigenous communities and $2.2 billion to help end the national tragedy of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. This has been a year when we have learned that each of us truly is our brothers and our sisters' keeper. Solidarity is getting us through this pandemic, and solidarity depends on each of us bearing our fair share of the collective burden. That's why, now more than ever, fairness in our tax system is essential. Afin d'assurer
To ensure our system is fair, this budget will invest in the fight against tax evasion, shine a light on beneficial ownership arrangements, and ensure that multinational corporations pay their fair share of tax in Canada. Our government is committed to working with our partners at the OECD to find multilateral solutions to the dangerous race to the bottom in corporate taxation. That includes work to conclude a deal on taxing large digital services companies. We are optimistic that such a deal can be reached this summer. Meanwhile, this budget reaffirms our government's commitment to impose such a tax unilaterally until an acceptable multilateral approach comes into effect. It's also fair to ask those who have prospered in this bleak year to do a little more to help those who still need help. That is why we are introducing a luxury tax on new cars and private aircraft worth more than $100,000 and on pleasure boats worth more than $250,000.
This budget lives up to our promise to do whatever it takes to support Canadians in the fight against COVID. And it makes significant investments in our future. All of this costs a lot of money. So it's entirely appropriate to ask, can we afford it? We can, and here's why. First, because this is a budget that invests in growth. The best way to pay our debts is to grow our
money. To put that in perspective, in any normal budget year, the entire budget would be about $350 billion. So that's just how big the deficit was last year. Now, for the year we're in a new fiscal year, and the budget this year is going to drop to $154 billion. That is still huge. And then it's going to drop even further, about $60-70 billion, down to about a deficit of, say, $30 billion by 2026. We went into this pandemic, the budget year prior, at about a $30 billion deficit. Those are big numbers. Can we afford it? Yes. Economists say it is sustainable in this low interest rate environment. If interest rates start to rise, then we could be into some issues. And the key metric I think that Canadians will look for when it comes to all these big, huge deficits is our debt to GDP ratio, our debt relative to the size of our national economy. Before the pandemic, it was sitting at about 30%. 30% of our economy equaled about 30% of our debt. All of our debt. Now, this year it's going to spike up to 50%, and it's going to stay at 50% even though the deficits start to get smaller because we've got this now trillion-dollar debt. But still we're spending not so much on servicing that debt. All that spending, what's it good for? Robin, here's the budget, okay? 724 pages. I've been doing this for covering federal budgets for more than 20 years now. I can't remember one this thick, and this is chock full of spending programs. $50 billion, 50 spending, $50 billion in spending programs in this fiscal year on top of all that emergency spending that is sticking around. The Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy, the Canada Emergency Rent Subsidy, they'll still be here. They're going to extend them till September, and they cost billions of dollars. But now what's in here, this $50 billion worth of spending, it's on pandemic and beyond, on the recovery, and of course the big highlight for Chrystia Freeland, the first female ever to present a budget in our history, is a national child care program. She's going to put down $30 billion over the next 5 years, but she needs the provinces to help her out with this. It's going to take a little while to get this thing, but before she leaves, she wants $10 a day child care for everyone in the country, just like they have in Quebec.
But it's not happening right away, though, is it? And by the way, I'm sure you read every single one of those 700 pages in the budget.
Absolutely, Robin, yes.
Yeah, it's a matter of negotiating, though, with the provinces. It's not like it's so easy to set up.
It isn't. And I told you, 720 pages, all these spending programs. Let me tell you what's not in the budget. There is no commitment by the Trudeau Liberals to increase the annual health care transfer to the provinces. It's called the Canada Health Transfer. And the premiers have been crying for an increase for the last year. They've met with Trudeau. They've had special meetings. Every time the premiers talk to Trudeau, they say, you got to give us more money for healthcare. This is not pandemic-related healthcare spending. This is ongoing healthcare, the cost of healthcare. And there is no commitment in this document, this budget, to increase the amount of the Canada Health Transfer. So when the Chrystia Freeland or whoever shows up at the next premiers meeting and says, hey guys, I got $30 billion for a new plan for childcare. Can you help me out? They'll say, sure, as soon as you give us what we need for health care. That's where that quid pro quo, I'm certain, is going to happen, and it may gum up Freeland's aspirations on daycare. And then there's another national plan that the Liberals sort of have bubbling under, pharmacare. There's about 4 paragraphs on pharmacare in this budget, and all they're saying is we'll continue to talk to the provinces about a national pharmacare program. Now, why is that important? Because this is a Trudeau minority government. They need one party to support this in order to get it through and avoid a general election. I'm looking at the New Democrats, most likely to deal here, and they've been crying for pharmacare. And they're going to look at this and say, where the heck is any movement on pharmacare? And it's not in here. So that may be an issue, more national programs. Other things not in here, there is no tax on the wealthy. Something else New Democrats had wanted. They want to get rid of billionaires. That's New Democrats. They certainly want to tax them. There is no new taxes on, no new income taxes on the wealthy, though there are new taxes on luxury goods. So Robin, if you were thinking of buying that new yacht for the season or a private aircraft, you will pay a little bit extra to the government for the pleasure.
I just do not have the salary for that, but thank you so much for your update on that. David Aiken in Ottawa. Let's bring in Sahir Khan with the Institute of Fiscal and International Studies. Sahir, it feels like we are bleeding red. Those were big numbers for a deficit. Did it give you heart palpitations?
This is what I wrote.
Well, I think that there's no question that it's a big budget. As David said, it's 700 plus pages. It's a lot of spending. But I think when you take a step back, we think, is it broadly fiscally sustainable? And the answer is yes. As David noted, it does depend on interest rates continue to stay low, but at their current rates. But it is broadly sustainable. I think the thing that got me kind of thinking about this is really what are we going to get for the money? And I think if we're going to pass on this amount of debt to the next generation, the issue is what are they getting for it? Are they getting a better labor force, better trained, better labor force participation, a bigger labor force? Are they getting high quality infrastructure? Are they getting innovation agenda that really builds the next generation of companies and entrepreneurs? If we are able to do that, if the government's able to do that and demonstrate results, then at least there's a legacy that's been purchased with that deficit financing. If it's transfers or really poor results, then I think they're going to be competing in the global economy with one hand tied behind their back.
So what are the risks that the Liberal government has by setting
clear in this budget, both in our commitment and also in our demonstrated actions, that following the extraordinary spending of this year, Canada's debt to GDP ratio will decline. And we show in our fiscal tables a clear declining trajectory, ending in 25-26 at a 49.2% debt to GDP ratio. Further, as we point out in the budget document, we commit to unwinding the COVID-related deficits, and our budget and our fiscal projections show precisely that. In 25-26, we come to a deficit of just 1.1%. So those, I would say to the honourable members and my colleague opposite, those are our anchors: a declining debt to GDP ratio and unwinding the COVID-related deficits.
Comments, questions et commentaires, l'honorable député de Joliette.
The honourable member for Joliette. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It is now my turn to sincerely congratulate the Minister of Finance on her first budget. This is certainly a historic moment, both for her and for the economy. There are some measures in here that are entirely unprecedented. So I would like to congratulate the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance. Very sincerely congratulate her on her hard work. There are a great many measures in this. Many of them are promising, and we will certainly come back to them and analyze them later. I would also like to underscore that this is the first time that I see a concrete promise made regarding fighting tax avoidance and evasion. Of course, here it still hasn't been fully implemented, but at least it's a concrete set of intentions. I'd like to congratulate the minister on this. Now, in my opinion, there are two major gaps in this budget. First of all, health funding. Quebec and the provinces have asked for more health funding. We are in the middle of a health crisis. For the Bloc Québécois, this is the moment to fix this. If not now, then when? And then secondly, the main victims of this pandemic have been seniors. We have been asking for old age security to be increased as of 65 years of age, instead of creating a two-tier system for seniors. But that's not in the budget. Why didn't the Minister of Finance include those two measures in the budget? Especially since when we look at the difference in the deficit between the fall economic statement and the deficit here in the budget, well, the difference would correspond to those two measures. So is this a political choice? Thank you. I would just like to remind members that I have a long list of members who wish to speak, so I would ask everyone to keep their questions and answers very short. The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for the question. And I'd like to thank my colleague for all the fascinating discussions that we've had throughout the preparation process of this budget. I've greatly appreciated working with him. Now, first of all, I am very pleased that
My honorable colleague has seen that we are taking action against tax evasion. That is a priority for our government, especially now during a pandemic. Social solidarity is crucial. And in order to reach a state of social solidarity, everyone needs to pay their fair share. We need to focus on that, and I'm looking forward to working with all my colleagues on this important point. Now, my colleague is from Quebec, and so I would like to take a moment to state for all members in this House that this budget and the commitments in it clearly show the importance of Quebec's political leadership. More than 20 years ago, Quebec decided to create a childcare system. It was difficult. It was very, very expensive. In fact, that's what I was told by Quebec architects of the system, that it was very expensive, I know. But Quebec showed us something very important. That having a child care system ultimately leads to excellent economic returns. Thus, it is very important for me as an Anglophone from Toronto to say thank you to Quebec. I don't see any women from Quebec here in the room right now, but I would really like to thank the feminists of Quebec who have worked so hard to build that program. Thank you. Now,
During this uncertain time, we're doing our part. Our financial centers may be closed for in-person meetings, but our dedicated financial advisors are adapting to the new reality of virtual and electronic business, focusing on what they do best, listening and providing professional advice to you, their clients. Our more than 700 financial advisors across Canada have been working tirelessly to respond to your questions and concerns. Being proactive and committed, they aim to bring a sense of confidence and security in your financial future, despite the circumstances. Our financial advisors are here for you, now more than ever. From all of us at Desjardins Financial Security Independent Network, stay safe and healthy.